This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are talking with Peter Lawler about his new book, American Heresies and Higher Education, and also his new position as editor of the journal Modern Age. Peter Lawler is Dana Professor of Government at Berry College. He served on President George W. Bush's Council on Bioethics, and he is the author of numerous books. I'll list a few, the ones that I've read. Stuck with Virtue, Aliens in America, Modern and American Dignity, and a superb introduction to ISI's edition of Orestes Bronson's American Republic. I'll mention that Peter blogs at National Review Online's The Corner, and he'll sometimes even throw a bone to us at Law and Liberty. However, Peter, glad to have you on the program.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, Peter, let's start with news of your latest venture, an important one. You are the newly named editor of the storied journal Modern Age. Tell us what you plan in this new role.
Well, Modern Age was founded by Russell Kirk, and it's been associated with the more traditional form of conservatism. I'm taking over, I think, at a very confusing moment for conservatives. And so my goal is to just enlarge the tent of Modern Age a bit. Literary, philosophical, and theological resources to bear on the problem of our time when conservatism seems to be so adrift. When conservatives seem not to be with the liberals, the rational control liberals, the progressives, and conservatives are at least somewhat alienated from the populism of Trump. Can we recover what Orestes Bronson called the providential constitution? That is the relational contents of our understanding of liberty. Can we reconcile liberty once again with the indispensable foundations we find in our great tradition?
So on Modern Age, obviously, George Nash was just on the program, and we talked about his great book, The Intellectual Conservative Movement Since 1945, which starts with the three groups of anti-communists, libertarians, and then traditionalist conservatives, and then he updated it later on for neoconservatives and the religious right. And then I asked him, so we kind of have a new category, it would seem, for populist conservatism. In your role as the editor of Modern Age, how do you plan on incorporating, or do you plan on incorporating that outlook into what you're publishing?
Well, populist conservatism is a problem because conservatism implies a kind of elitism, a kind of preferential option for cultural literacy and all that. And so there's this conservative suspicion of vulgarity understood in terms of pop culture, vulgarity understood in terms of turning everything over to commerce. So I'm going to be a bit more open to finding remnants of our tradition in popular culture, celebrating the new birth of a little bit at least of television excellence made possible by Netflix and Amazon Prime and all the other premium channels. But more than that, it really is true, right, that populism or populists lie with the conservatives and being against the experts and being for the common sense of ordinary people. So much of what they call political correctness is expert lunacy, opinions developed in a very refined bubble that ordinary people just don't buy. And so we're going to celebrate maybe a bit more of the dignified relational lives of ordinary people and how they're undermined today not only by the 21st century global competitive marketplace, but also by progressive elitism, which includes corporate elitism.
So thinking, it's interesting, a couple of thoughts come to mind. One on populism. So we say populist conservatism, which an accurate moniker, but at the same time, it's not like other forms of populism it seems to me when we think of that term, not just because we're in America and not in, say, Argentina or another country, but it's a populism that has been made momentous and given strength by this sort of mentality and separation of our elites so dramatically so in the last 20 or 30 years from the rest of the population, such that, as you have suggested, we have a country split apart.
Well, right. So American populism, where do you find it? Well, one place is country music. Country music is about the citizen soldier who puts God, country, and family first. The American populist is typically conservative, more devoted to traditional family values, more likely to have a church home, more likely than not to think about America as a force for good in the world, more likely than not to either be in military service or respect people in military service. Our populists are our firefighters, our police, the people in Staten Island who, to tell you the truth, who voted for Trump. And so there's a kind of an honorable kind of populism in America that other countries don't have. That we don't have the class-based labor movement you'd find in England or the other European countries.
Yeah, so thinking about that, I mean, the danger would be, the traditional danger of populism is that the government itself its spending, its regulatory machinations are brought into the service of certain clientele groups, and it gets out of control, and the government itself loses all discipline. What sort of problems, potentialities do you see right now in this sort of populist conservatism that helped elect Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, two things populism, two dangers. The twin dangers of populism is it's too angry and it's too gullible. So with respect to Trump, Trump fed into the legitimate anger so many ordinary people have directed against both parties. Neither party cares about the fact that skilled labor is faring worse in this country. Neither party cares about the fact that say with respect to our public schools, our top public schools are getting better. Most of our public schools are getting worse. And so the anger is neither party cares much about the fact that ordinary people are stuck fighting these stupid wars that conducted by our last two administrations and so forth and so on. But populists are also incredibly gullible. They believe all this stuff Trump says about building the wall, making better deals, making America great again. And so populists are easy prey for fake news. Populists are easy prey for overpromises concerning what government can do. Subject
to anger, and when that gullibility is exposed.
Yeah, but anger is both good and bad, like everything else. So populists are spirited. That's good. Yeah. They're too spirited. That's bad.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So we've kind of been talking about this. Moving towards your book, American Heresies and Higher Education, so maybe talk a little bit about that. Talk about the American Heresies part. What are those? How do we know they're heresies?
Well, so from the point of view of a deep traditionalist Catholic, America is rife with heresies. That is, inadequate understandings of who we are from the point of view of our great Christian natural law tradition. And there's truth to that. But the upside of that is heresies have part of the truth embedded in them. For example, our Pentecostals, surely they do not, they're weak theologically. They lack discipline. They even lack books. But they're strong in grace. They're strong in charity. They're strong in living the Word. So just like the populists are too spirited, Pentecostals are full of Holy Ghost spirit. Well, that's not the whole Christianity. That's part of it, though. Yeah. And so if you want to find the religion in America that lives in either the that anyone can be a member of the City of God, would be our Pentecostals. In the same way, even our founders, a lot of them were followers of John Locke. John Locke is a Christian heretic. He was all about freedom. And there's a lot to be said for freedom. That we're not merely parts of nature, or not really merely parts of country, but every human being is unique and irreplaceable. And so there's so much good about that. Where Locke is weak, though, is understanding the relational side of freedom, that personal identity is necessarily constituted by an interpersonal web. But better the heresy than nothing. And so America at its best is kind of this web of heresies that kind of counter each other. The Lockeans are too unrelational. And our Puritans still have a future with a lot of our moralistic liberal Democrats. They're too politically intrusive. But let's tell the truth, they really do care about their fellow citizens. So in a certain sense, the greatness of America is this moral and intellectual diversity that balances the heresies against each other. For example, the Declaration of Independence was kind of a compromise between the Lockean founders and the residually Calvinist or puritanical founders. As a result, in our Declaration, the God of nature is also the providential and judgmental God of the Bible. So our Declaration, the product of deliberation and compromise, is better than the heretical thought of the parties to the compromise.
So interesting you say in the opening of this book that there's sort of a web of text informing your study, maybe even allowing you to pronounce upon American heresies. You mentioned Tocqueville, of course, Democracy in America, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's great speech, We Have Ceased to See the Purpose, and the 8th book of Plato's Republic. These all sort of helping you unlock the excesses of democracy, or just pure democracy, which is obviously part of the American experience.
Well, right. I mean, it's a good point, right? That in order to call a heresy, you have to have a standpoint by which you judge heresies according to a non-heretical point of view. So I do that through enduring dissident texts, like Tocqueville, who was a friendly critic of democracy. Tocqueville, who balanced aristocracy against democracy, criticizing aristocracy from the point of view of democracy, and democracy from the point of view of aristocracy. Or Solzhenitsyn, who criticized the West from the point of view of dissident political thought, anti-communist political thought. And so we saw ideological currents both in the East and the West. And in Socrates in the Republic, who was a friendly critic of democracy. He wasn't so against democracy, because democracy was a place philosophy could flourish. Democracy is the only place you could have the discussion, the freewheeling, incredibly open discussion you have in the Republic. But the trouble with democracy is it doesn't have any spirit. The trouble with democracy is it doesn't have any standards. The trouble with democracy, everything is good. The trouble with democracy is there's no spirit of resistance. So if you think about it, the trouble with American education today is it's too democratic. It doesn't have an aristocratic component. It can't find standards higher than competency and diversity. Now, diversity is good, but diversity is not a bottom line.
Yeah.
Term self-interest, not in the long term. They're putting themselves out of jobs. Tenure and tenure-track faculty will be replaced by online professors who are contract workers. This, of course, is happening in all areas of American employment, not just in colleges and universities. So your liberally educated professor from who went to graduate school at Baylor or the University of Dallas or something like that, they've always found their work at second and third-rate colleges, basically, regional state colleges, small Catholic colleges, and so forth. It's hard to see how these colleges have a future now, unfortunately. So the residential college is going to be a niche experience, It's going to be very expensive, but the students aren't going to pay the expense so much. The college is going to raise the money, and because in fact college is not nearly as expensive as libertarians think. You have the sticker price, but no one pays the sticker price. So in my college, for example, the student pays 49 cents on the dollar, which if you consider you got to sleep somewhere, you got to eat somewhere, it's really not a bad deal.
Yeah.
And and so all your loan outrages are really bad colleges suckering, gullible students. And that there are a lot of people who don't get adequate advice concerning how to negotiate with colleges and so forth, which of course is why you're typically undereducated American should start in community college where you can get a little bit of savvy before you move on to a residential college. But so the future of higher education is not so good, right? And it's exacerbated by the fact that our PhD programs are preparing people to be niche specialists, preparing them to be researchers, preparing them for a very few number of jobs, not preparing them so much for undergraduate education, not preparing them to teach the wide array of courses an undergraduate professor has to teach. So our professors are less prepared for the job market. One piece of bad news. The job market is sort of disappearing on them. Another piece of bad news. So I would be very reluctant to tell a young person to get a PhD today in political philosophy or in literature or something like that. So the future of liberal education might actually be outside the college walls and in some way.
Interesting. Interesting.
But I say that regretfully. I wish that weren't true.
So you think, with regard to the humanities itself, you see that as a declining civic enterprise?
Well, I mean, people blame the humanities for having become, on the one hand, too politically correct, or all about race, class, gender, heterosexualism, and so forth. And on the other hand, aping the natural sciences, so becoming like digital humanities and all that. Shakespeare as collaborative enterprise that can be grasped in terms of various metrics and so forth. And those are real problems. But the bigger problem is our colleges no longer understand liberal education to be a bottom line. So they don't think they have the time, or students have the interest to prepare students to be cultivated human beings, to prepare them for lifelong education in the more leisurely sense. But in fact, this is a very condescending way of looking at people and democracy, because in fact, every American is going to spend a lot of his or her life in front of the screen. And shouldn't we be preparing students to use the screen with discernment, not for internet games and porn and angry and gullible niche websites, but in fact, it is a wonderful thing that every American has access to all the resources of all the world's cultures for free on the screen.
Yeah.
And every American has access to the most wonderful movies and television shows like The Crown.
Yeah.
But they don't have the resources, they don't have the education required to understand them. So isn't it true that no one wants to talk about it? We're entering, I think, into a post-employment situation where more and more Americans, in fact, are not going to have meaningful work. So what are these people supposed to do? They still have to have dignified relational lives. They still have to use their leisure well to flourish as human beings. So from that point of view, liberal education is more important than ever. And it's a lie that it's that hard. It's a lie that most people can't benefit from it. For example, in my class, everyone benefits from reading Tocqueville, including students who aren't hardwired in that direction particularly.
Yeah. Interesting thinking here, though. It sounds like, so let's say liberal arts education declines and declines. There are all sorts of opportunities, it seems, for schools, small liberal arts colleges, religious colleges, strangely enough, that will sort of continue and distinguish themselves by offering this education. And that says nothing of, I think with this interesting article in the New York Times last week on conservative boot camp that offered by the Hertog Foundation, offered by Liberty Fund, which I wouldn't say Liberty Fund is conservative boot camp, but the attempt to read great text and write of liberty and responsibility.
They left ISI out, yeah.
And so in a way you say, so it continues beyond or apart from the campus. So we already see some ways that could be the case. But I suppose it really is the case, though. It's, you say cost isn't that big of a problem, but that's, really sort of what's standing in the way here, it seems, from the humanities being viable for most people.
Yeah, okay. Number one, let me correct my two kinds of colleges: those that go online and those that are mixed residential. A third category that I should have mentioned, not as confident of it, but there is some future for it, would be relatively non-selective small colleges that actually have missions, because the market for the mission is expanding with all these homeschool kids, these small Christian schools, and so forth. So these
the classical schooling phenomenon is pretty interesting in the last 10 years. You've seen a lot of these schools spring up. Yeah.
So the classical high school corresponds to the classical college, like Thomas Aquinas. So maybe there'll be more colleges like that.
Yeah.
And if I were to start one, which I'm not, so I don't want any calls and letters on this. I would begin with this proposition: the humanities are cheaper than anything else.
Should be, yeah.
Because they require no infrastructure.
Yeah.
So colleges are expensive because they all have to have amenities. They have to have, athletics, hotel-style dorms, health club gyms, student affairs staffs that act like concierges, and so forth and so on. You could pretty much dispense with all that. You could also dispense, I think, in many cases, with the residential campus.
Yeah.
Because it's not like residential campuses improve students morally so much anymore. They just become a problem. So you get a college in your mind. You pick out a small town that's cheap, maybe a Rust Belt town that has apartments, restaurants, strip malls, and all that. You rent out some office spaces downtown. You hire liberal arts PhDs who just simply can't find jobs. You pay them adequately, but you give them a heavy teaching load, and you don't offer them tenure. Because you're not sure the college is going to have a future, and you know it's a risk, so you can't. You don't want to make false promises to them, because tenure doesn't mean anything if the place closes. You get out of the residential business, you get out of the sports business, and you pretty much just offer courses based upon books. You don't need to have a library, because in the libraries aren't so important anymore because everything's online. Right. So you locate near a community college where students could go there for the indispensable resources. You might go as far as to have the students take their natural science courses at the community college. So your only cost is the minimal rent for these buildings. Very small administrative staff. You have to registrar, and you have a person to oversee where the students are living and stuff like that. You pay these professors, and this is what they get. You pay these professors about $60,000 a year, and they live in a Rust Belt town, so it's not so much. And that's your whole budget. You could probably bring the cost down to about $15,000 a year per student.
Yeah.
Maybe less even, but the student would be responsible for their own living and eating arrangement. And then you turn that in manner of Hillsdale into a fundraising niche opportunity. And then maybe you could do without government loans, And if you do without government loans, then you can do without accreditation, because accreditation is a very lame form of signaling. No one says this student has been well educated because he or she went to an accredited college. Because there are some really bad accredited colleges that are graduating hordes of students.
Yeah. So we just need to get the Gates Foundation to fund this, Peter. That would work beautifully.
I'm not relying on them, but
I'm just kidding.
I think the DeVos family might come in on this.
That'd be good.
And they really might. I'm actually not kidding at that point. And maybe with some government encouragement in some way.
Yeah.
But
so your point, but just to reiterate, I mean, your point is it's actually the online resources that could refacilitate a genuine classical liberal learning environment and do so in a way that's very cheap, very competent, very effective, and could give a lot of students exactly what they're looking for. It's interesting you say that. I mean, a lot of the classical schools, I think of just the ones in Indianapolis, actually just rent office space very cheaply, and their tuition is, half to a third of what other private schools in the city charge. So there's obviously there's a model already for what you're describing.
Sure, you can do that, right? And but I'm not for having a purely online experience because these summer camps you're talking about, these are very, and not in a creepy way, but very erotic experiences where the students, they're like the Plato's symposium. Students stay up all night talking very passionately with each other about these perennial issues, and so the community, I think, is indispensable. You talk to students who go to St. John's and Thomas Aquinas,
there really is community at those schools.
They don't remember their classes exactly, but they kind of remember the whole thing, where all they do all day long is talk to people who are psyched up about these things as they are. So you can't do this online. I'm not against in many cases online programs are better than nothing. I'm not against the Hillsdale, Ashbrook online master's degrees, but they are kind of lame compared to what.
Well, when I asked that question, I didn't mean that these places you're describing would set up online, but just that resources a student might need are available cheaply online, so that cuts down on a lot of costs. That's all I meant.
Right.
No, but I still envisioned the real classroom Socratic type of an experience. That was.
Right,
Yeah.
And you really don't need library. I mean, this may seem odd or heretical, but you don't need libraries anymore. Our library here is being emptied out of books. It's almost all online resources.
Yeah.
And now books are so cheap. Any book you want, you can buy. All the great books are.
Yes.
And the best translations are very, very cheap. Why would students go to the library? And sure, articles and journals, where they're all available online. No one looks at hard copies of journals anymore.
And if you think about the gig economy, as I'm learning, one can basically contract out all administrative tasks very cheaply. So why would you need a raft of administrators? Yeah.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, and so administration's easier. Being a registrar is easier because it's all computerized. Not that I know the details of it, but record keeping is easy. Thomas More in New Hampshire, last time I was there, the faculty members were administrators on the side. That may not be such a great idea because faculty members aren't necessarily any good at that. But you only need two. And again, the administrators are people who love this sort of thing. They get paid $60,000 a year too, and they're glad to do it if they're dedicated to the mission of the place. So you have so many people out there with classy liberal arts PhDs who either don't have jobs or hate their jobs because they're not teaching what they love.
Yeah. So there's your market opportunity.
So, but keep in mind that this isn't for everyone. So if you go to these various summer camps in Hertog or ISI and all the others, what you get there are kids who are incredibly well raised by parents who took an interest in every feature of their lives. So you have this kind of conservative helicopter parenting in a very good way, right? Mm-hmm. So the thing I've always noticed is these kids are so close to their parents. Their homes are full of learning. their homes are full of faith, and so sometimes I'm just awed about how perfect they are compared to me. But meanwhile, 95% of the country doesn't enjoy that opportunity.
Yeah, no.
Ordinary parents, when both parents work, ordinary parents don't have time for this sort of thing. So one parent is a school teacher, the other parent works at Walmart. They don't have time to do this kind of things.
Yeah. Thinking about going forward then, we talked about so interesting community colleges. Obviously, there will be some sort of way in which a lot of teaching is scripted. It seems to me MOOCs will be involved, maybe not as much as people were thinking 5 years ago, but should play a role, and we'll continue, and then we'll still have this sort of elite, stratum of education, and maybe what you're describing takes off, and then of course we've got the religious colleges as well, and then various tech and vocational schools, and of course it's interesting you're thinking about the land grant schools like Purdue at Indiana, other schools whose original mission was to help mechanize and settle these new territories and states, producing engineering graduates. These schools seem to be doing very well also from my vantage point.
All right, yeah, so, okay, we're unpacking this now. Okay, number one, so I have no objection to STEM education at all, and most bright young people are going to go into medicine or engineering or the real sciences, the experimental sciences, and so forth. And Purdue, I would say, has a great president. Purdue is better off than ever, although I was on a panel with Mitch Daniels, and he said, I hope he was telling the truth, that he loses sleep because people graduate from Purdue without having had to take history. But in general, I'm not as concerned about that. Or high IQ kids don't take history in college. I'm not losing that much sleep over that myself. Yeah. But okay, so you have the high IQ STEM kids, the one group of kids. Number two, you have the geniuses at the elite schools who learned enough in high school to graduate from college. They have these fabulous teenage resumes of accomplishment. So you could hang out at Harvard for 4 years, not doing much, taking politically correct stuff, and the marketplace still wants you because you were good enough in high school, you could have skipped college. But the students who are being underserved are the students who are being herded into techno-light majors like communications, management, sports management, exercise science, these very specific majors that allegedly prepare you for a very narrow niche in the marketplace. You don't learn enough from these majors.
Yeah.
And there's no attention paid to your basic skills either in
no writing,
no writing, and no math either, and no math and no writing. Yeah. And so it's these students who are being underserved. And so I can give you a whole polemic in how we're treating our STEM students as cogs and machines. And to which you would respond, "That's modern science for you. What are you going to do about that?" And the answer is, "Well, nothing."
But interesting. So, interesting. Part of your book too is how thinking about the American heresies. So a Lockean capitalist individualistic focus is obviously played out in our higher education system, and we've talked about part of that now, just both with regard to the Ivies and also maybe with the STEM colleges as well, the land grant schools. But then also we have sort of the Puritan contribution, which is rife. There are a lot of schools that have this aspect. We've seen somewhat of an uptick, it seems to me, in some pretty serious religious schools, which also offer a good education. And then we have sort of the schools that were formed with that original Puritan spirit, which are now sort of dens of political correctness that no, I think, sane person would want to go to. I think of Oberlin College being one, which came right out of that emphasis, and yet now you look at it. So there's also that part of higher education and sort of that interplay with larger currents in American intellectual life as well, and it goes on and it develops, it mutates, it evolves to the current state.
Yeah, right. So I pick on Oberlin too much, but it's, the neo-puritanical writer Marilyn Robinson, who reminded me that Oberlin, say in 1840, antebellum Oberlin,
Yeah.
had a real liberal education.
And you had to work, right?
Every professor had to work. Every student read the great books, including the free blacks and women. It was so it was the most egalitarian college in the country, one of the most serious liberal education colleges in the country. And so the theory of Oberlin was the theory of St. Augustine. Liberal education and work are contemplation and work. They're both for everyone. But then when Oberlin loses its religious mission, it becomes kind of, it loses that genuine egalitarianism and becomes like achingly self-referential and politically correct in the mode of Lena Dunham, the most famous current.
The most current,
graduate.
Yes. It's interesting, too. I mean, you can make that point overall, I think, that as the humanities or classical liberal ideal has been lost in a way, that was the central identity of America. That is such a core feature of American higher education that it then could become anything or more likely subject to just serving technological productive impulses in our country.
Yeah, so I mean, so to give you other examples. I mean, the ordinary Catholic schools in our country, which at one time included, say, Villanova and Notre Dame. Notre Dame was a very ordinary university where professors taught a 4-4 load. His point was to turn young men, in some cases young women, of course.
They went to St. Mary's.
Yeah, right. They went to St. Mary's, who were the children of immigrants, to turn them into Catholic ladies and gentlemen, which meant taking 12 hours of philosophy, 12 hours of theology, and not even so much reading the great books, but just learning what people like us believe, and learning kind of a cultivated discourse. And the techno-vocational thing was real at those colleges, but also secondary. So the main thing is, for a long time, Christian education in America was this kind of non-condescending egalitarianism, which was based on this: every human being grows up to be a civilized Christian, or like civilized Jew or whatever. And so there was a huge part of American assimilation. You don't surrender your culture, you don't surrender your faith, but become a civilized person in this country.
Yeah, interesting as well. That gives you a new way to think about work. That work is not all that we're about. We're not just middle class productive people. That's a good thing. Work is good, but there's also something higher for us to be engaged in.
Yeah, and they should be connected with our colleges, everyone, like in the South. I mean, this is a cliche, this half true. We have terrible public schools and outstanding Sunday schools, and people study more for Sunday school than they do for regular school. And there are a lot of obvious disadvantages to that, but one advantage would be Sunday school in a certain way is more important. Yeah. It's more central to who you are. But, a part of our diversity in higher education was that what you learn in Sunday school used to be part of higher education. Even the Ivies were started as Christian schools.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right. So we turned out not to be able to hold on to the substance of liberal education when we enter the post-Christian era, and then the vacuum is filled with competency and diversity. So you have to tell the truth. It's partly the fault of people who tell us what liberal education is, that so many people now think it's worthless. Like all your libertarian productivity and efficiency reformers, they say liberal education committed suicide. We didn't kill it. Yeah. They add, we're kind of glad they committed suicide, so we don't have to waste any time on it anymore. But no one's given an adequate argument for it.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, but I think, it seems so obvious in thinking about the economy that is developing, which we don't know, and there's a lot of people on pins and needles as to what that will look like, how it will shape, how artificial intelligence, for example, will transform or take away jobs. And then of course, the obvious question is, well, so the best thing you could do for yourself from that standpoint is learning how to read text, learning how to write well, learning how to speak effectively, learning how to be serious and careful and precise with your language, and all of these sorts of skills that you learn in that environment, which of course one doesn't learn majoring in business management.
Well, sure. I mean, it really is true. Employers are looking for people with good manners, who show up for work, and who can,
yeah. Well,
you know,
that, yeah.
who can actually see what words mean.
Yeah.
Right, and to have a large active vocabularies. And the only way you get a large active vocabulary is see how words play out in contexts of real books. So, for example, it's a terrible time to beat up on poor Marco Rubio. When Rubio said we need fewer philosophers and more welders, 90% of the welders would be out of work in a generation. Their work is being automated.
Yeah.
Still, people should be. I have no objection to people being welders. I admire welders because they do stuff I could never do. But we have to get back to the old-fashioned American vision of the philosopher welder, like the welder who actually has decent skills beyond welding.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, we could say, well, we never had that, which is not at all true. Someone who graduated from a public school in our country, even 3 generations ago, really did know how to read and write. No journalist went to college and went right from high school to journalism,
right?
Because
right.
your skills were perfectly adequate for that.
No,
I mean, you read real books in high school. You knew grammar and style.
Yeah. No, I mean, and one looks at you can look at exit tests that people were taking in the 8th grade, 50 or 60. I mean, I've seen tests from the late 19th century that are astounding. That's the level of knowledge that was presumed students knew, which was not even the ballpark of what students know now.
Yeah, and education was, by our standards, incredibly anal, right?
Yeah.
So when I went to, I think the last generation of old-fashioned Catholic schools with the Sisters of St. Joseph, whose mission is to beat up on immigrant kids. Which you literally, it's not for this, but beating up was a little bit of it. But you learned how to diagram sentences, right? And you really needed to know how to do it, and I was okay with that. But your penmanship had to be perfect, and because I have left-hander's disease, I would get D's in penmanship. And if you ever saw my office, you would know why I got D minuses in neatness. And because they didn't let you slide on these things, and you had to know the times tables by 4th grade, and so I can do my whole life. I've been great doing math in my head. I still do my own taxes by hand. So you don't need this skill anymore, but you really do, because you have to be able to understand the numbers some accountant generated for you.
The formation of virtues. Virtue is hard. Vice is easy, and one has to be habituated in those in order to freely choose. I guess the habit of sitting in a desk. So I tell my students, before you can benefit from this intrinsically valuable, highly erotic class in political philosophy, you had to be tortured for years. You can sit in that desk for an hour, not say anything, and not let me know how much you're disliking it. That's, in fact, the truth of the situation. So, I mean, it's not the way I like to talk, but what employers want is ordinary bourgeois virtue. Yeah. So even in the service industry, it's a cliche now that the qualities prized most of all are conscientiousness and compliance, which turns out to be just showing up, doing what you're told, and being able to pay attention to directions. It's amazing how short in supply these qualities are now. Yeah.
And they were generated as a matter of course by relatively old-fashioned education.
So Peter, on that note, if we're thinking now, broadly, and I'll just ask you to forecast here at the end. Higher education, is there you don't see probably a deterministic path of of decline overall, but you see the hope would be that the diversity which has marked American higher education could continue to flourish by, in many respects, getting the government out of the way, or to the extent it's in the way, it's in support of the diversity itself.
Well, right. I mean, so in other words, all the government can do or has to do is don't erect artificial barriers to the diversity, which means message to conservatives: lay off, let Oberlin be Oberlin.
Yeah.
The Oberlin students are graduating with a minimum competency required to flourish in the workforce. Let Oberlin be accredited. Don't mess with them.
Yeah.
And if conservative professors aren't welcome there, let them go somewhere else.
Yeah.
The way you counter Oberlin is with a better product, not with trying to reform Oberlin, not imposing viewpoint diversity in Oberlin or whatever.
Yeah.
So we are in fact going to stay with a system of government subsidized loans now, make them with very few strings attached, and the strings should be minimum competency, such that Oberlin has to show its students are graduating more competent than the students at the really bad regional state college down the road. And keeping in mind, the really bad regional state college down the road might be doing as well as it can, because, in fact, higher education is getting more stratified in terms of IQ and socioeconomic background. Sure, Oberlin is diverse, but Oberlin is a diverse amalgam of rich kids.
That's right.
Yeah, and Thomas Aquinas is diverse. It's diverse hotbed of all kinds of homeschool kids and classically school kids. So, in other words, I mean, so it was great in our country in some ways, which is why I'm not that. I mean, I'm ambivalent about school choice. It was a great thing in our country when we had socioeconomically diverse public schools and parochial schools and all that, where poor girls can meet and marry rich guys and the other way around, and ordinary kids could display their virtue before people with status and all that. But these days aren't with us so much anymore. It might be good in principle to have a kind of common education from which all Americans benefit, but we're not going to have that now. And so we have to fall back on this gift of diversity, which is, in fact, the envy of the world.
Yeah.
I mean, no other country has this, which means when you have a genuinely diverse environment, some things are going to be loony and some things are going to be mediocre. But America's gift is not uniform excellence, and it never will be. America's gift will be pockets of different kinds of excellence.
Pockets of different kind of excellence. Peter, on that, we'll come to a close. Thank you for your time today. We've been talking with Peter Lawler, author of American Heresies in Higher Education and the new editor of Modern Age. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.